Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to talk about dungeons, which to be honest is one of my favorite things when it comes to imagining adventures. You know, very epic sort of storytelling component, if you will, whether it be a movie that we're watching, whether it be an RPG, video game, tabletop, it doesn't matter. Exploring the dungeon while you write down your little map, because you want to get the treasure, and at the same time don't forget to put on your helmet so that if you get ambushed by one of those skeletons, at least, you know, you survive the gig. That's such an awesome helmet, by the way. Now, generally speaking, whenever we use the word dungeon, since it's strongly connected to pop culture and adventures and fantasy and books, normally you imagine these labyrinthic undergrounds that are found under castles, that are found under strongholds, fortresses, and sometimes even cities. But how real of a thing is it when we connect it and try to overlap it with the real European Middle Ages? In other words, did dungeons exist in the medieval period? And if so, how different or similar were they to the ones that are now part of our collective imagination? If the term dungeon in our imagination now immediately connects to a labyrinth of underground prisons, cells and chambers linked by poorly lit corridors and tunnels, this image, first promoted by Romantic literature, is quite far from what actual medieval dungeons were. The term dungeon derives from the French donjon, which in terms comes from the late Latin Dominionis, meaning property, quarters of the Lord, and initially did not indicate tunnels or underground dungeons, but rather the central tower or keep of the castle, its most defensive part, if you will, where the most important personalities tended to reside. Now, precisely because this section of a castle would be the most easily defensible and the hardest to reach during a possible attack or siege, that would have been the place where the most important prisoners of war or political prisoners would have been kept. Also keeping in mind that in this medieval historical context, a ransom, the kind of money that you could get in order to give back an important enemy of war that you had captured, such as a nobleman, was a very lucrative endeavor. These VIP prisoners, if you will, or political opponents, were kept under surveillance in a dedicated room within this keep. Now, in England, where the castle building carried out by the Franco-Normans significantly marked the territory during the first half of the late Middle Ages, this phenomenon led to a gradual shift in the meaning of the term donjon. And therefore, this word ended up going through a linguistic process which is called, technically, a synecdoche. A synecdoche is a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole, or vice versa. In other words, is a type of metonymy, the substitution of the name of an attribute for that of the thing meant. An example would be a suit for a business executive. So, through this linguistic process, the word that indicated the central fortress began to be used to refer to just one of its elements, namely the cell/dungeon, whose original name was actually Oubliette, from the French oublier, meaning to forget, from the idea that whoever was locked up was thus forgotten by the world. So interesting. Now, having established this, or the origin of how the word dungeon becomes to mean not just the castle or this central keep, but actually the underground prison, if you will, it is also important to say that still these oubliettes, so these cells, were very different from the way we imagine a labyrinthic dungeon. In other words, they were rather often simply a walled room accessible by a single door or a trapdoor, in the case of, for example, an underground chamber corresponding to the foundations of the tower. However, the idea constructed by the literary imagination led, in the early years of archaeology, to misinterpret much of the evidence related to the underground environments connected to castles, interpreting as prisons what were simply cellars, or animal bone remains of dietary origins as remnants of imprisoned victims. Now, even today, when it comes to castles and their undergrounds as touristic attractions, there is a tendency to misrepresent a little bit what people are seeing, in the sense that these undergrounds areas are usually represented as a sort of continuum of rooms, tunnels and corridors used for the confinement of prisoners, even though sometimes originally these quote-unquote dungeons were not even communicating with each other. And if among these there may sometimes actually be a real dungeon, so the actual prison cell, the rest is almost always made up of drainage conduits, latrines, warehouses, ice houses, pantries, cellars, and even mines, and counter mines related to sieges. So a varied picture with ambience used for many different reasons, which in a way does get close to the way we imagine dungeons in, for example, D&D. However, these are exceptions, which see specific fortresses actually develop articulated dungeons consisting of different environments and a congruous number of cells. And one of these is the famous Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, a Norman fortress built in 1070 above a previous Saxon installation, perhaps a cemetery. The underground chambers of Pontefract, carved into the rock, extend to more than 10 meters below ground level, articulating into several environments, of which at least 5 have been identified as cells. So the dungeon proper, if you will. Now, we know that Richard II of England was imprisoned in Pontefract's dungeons, and these castle dungeons were so famous they were immortalized in at least 2 of Shakespeare's works, namely Richard II and the more famous Richard III. It is in fact in Richard III that Shakespeare mentions the fortress in its original 16th century name, Pomfret. We read, "O Pomfret, O thou bloody prison, fatal and ominous to noble peers, within the gilt closure of thy walls Richard II here was hacked to death." Close quotes. However, it is precisely the exceptionality of Pontefract that makes it famous in a context where normally, as already mentioned, castle dungeons, when present, were limited to a single small room. And one of the reasons why is because in the Middle Ages, the needs the dungeons had to meet were relatively few. Detention as a punishment was not widespread, mostly related to the capture and surveillance of members of the noble class who could not be put to death too carelessly or who were held for their political value as hostages in view of a ransom, as mentioned before. So this idea of the emergence of imposing an articulated, fortified dungeon in order to hold lots of prisoners doesn't happen really in the Middle Ages, or at least not commonly, but it's mostly a Renaissance thing, when detention sentences begin to spread in Europe. A prime example of this is the Château d'If on the eponymous island of the Friul archipelago in the Gulf of Marseille, built in the first half of the 16th century. Now, this castle was made popular and famous by the novel made by Alexandre Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo, and the Vicomte de Bragelonne. This chateau was developed on 2 main floors: the ground floor cells, which had no windows and had very poor hygienic conditions, and the first floor cells, which in addition to being more spacious, were equipped with windows and a fireplace. However, the second type of cells could only be accessed by paying a monthly fee, a sort of rent, if you will, and therefore were limited to detainees from the wealthiest families. Now, on this note of more intricate Renaissance or sort of post-medieval sort of fortresses and their dungeons, we have another situation that has to do with the first castle that we mentioned, Pontefract. You see, this castle saw an expansion of its dungeons in the mid-1600s with the English Civil War, during which part of its cellars were converted into prisons. The various inscriptions found on the walls of Pontefract's underground chambers left by those who were imprisoned there relate specifically to this context. However, it is between the 18th and 19th century, with the rise of nation-states, that we see the peak of fortified prisons, since the establishment of strong and autocratic national entities necessarily coincides with the needs to suppress opposition and remove adversaries and agitators from the political scene in a manner acceptable to public opinion. So no hanged, drawn and quartered. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. It was in 1783 that the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II decided to transform a wing of the Spielberg fortress into a prison, converting several of its casemates and powder magazines into cells. The project was completed in 1820, and Spielberg would house the most bitter opponents of the Habsburg regime, including Hungarian, Italian, and Polish irredentists. So, all in all, in the real medieval period, you did have the occasional dungeon with multiple cells, which would then have also corridors that sometimes would be connected, sometimes wouldn't be connected, but in general you would have a whole underground underneath a fortress or a castle, which also contained storage houses, mine houses, and all sorts of different areas and rooms. But in general, in the medieval period, when you did have a dungeon, it was a single room, and it will become more typical of the late medieval period, mostly the Renaissance, and then the early modern age, the usage or even conversion of entire sections of castles into full-on prisons, more similar to the dungeons of our fantasy tales. Regardless, if you found this video interesting, let me know, and of course thumbs up if possible, and if you like it, if you dislike it, please leave a comment if you agree, if you disagree, or if you think that maybe I missed something, feel free to write it in the comment section. If you're yet not a member of this community, become a noble one, subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.